Okay, welcome everybody. Steve Fancher, I'm your chair of the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District. We're going to call to order the January 23rd meeting. Time now is 1:02 and we are now called to order. Now let's do roll call.
I'm going to go backwards because Nancy's just joining us. Heather King is not available. We have word that Bob Salinger is on his way. Ed Washington also not present. Brent Cartwright.
Here.
Eric Molander.
Here.
Tammy Stephenson.
Here.
Mary Helen Kincaid. Unmute. Mary Helen, see if we can hear
Here.
you.
Here.
Awesome. I see Rochelle joining. Corky Collier.
Here.
Emerald Bogue. Here. Lori Stegman.
Here.
Ashton Simpson.
Here.
Seth Reeser.
Here.
Dave Ritma.
Here.
Eric Mueller.
Here.
Steve Fancher.
Here.
Nancy Hendrickson.
Here.
Rochelle Altman. Here. 14 board members present.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining. Before we get started, there are some proposed modifications to the agenda as initially sent out to you that I want to discuss. The first is that we had some comments on some kind of last minute comments on the December meeting minutes, and we haven't had a chance to fully get those incorporated into something that you can adopt as a board. So I'm going to propose that we put off the approval of the December minutes into our next meeting. That's my first proposal. My second proposal is going to have to do with the GeoBond vote referral. I'll just say a few things about that. You know, in all my experience kind of with public assets and trying to get elected bodies to move forward with funding for those assets, idealism has never worked in my favor. And in the face of political realities, having to pivot has always been something that has actually been effective for me. I think right now, staff is doing a ton of work with our political partners out there in the broader community. Staff has a lot to share in that space for us as a board to contemplate. So I think that rushing today to vote on that referral without having a discussion about all of the work that's been happening out there would be premature. So I am going to propose that we use today as that mechanism for us to continue that work session discussion, and that we plan on voting at the next meeting, the next business meeting. Jim, do you want to add to that? Or I guess we could, before we go there, unless you want to go there now, and then I'll ask if we have any opposition to that notion.
I would suggest to the board that that is a wise decision, and we can change that decision after you hear some additional conversation, but some of our critical partners have asked for some additional time, and we can go into that. And I think if you take that time, first of all, you will be better informed as a board in making your decisions. And I think we will serve the municipal and other partners that we're here to serve more effectively if we have a little bit more time to work through some final details. And I will say more later, but I do think we have some good news and some good forward progress to share with you. And you have some decisions to make around that.
So let's open the question. Eric and then Eric.
So our drop dead date for having a vote on referral is March 1, right?
That's the day that
No, please.
that's the day that the forms need to be submitted.
So
Very nice.
before that.
So theoretically, it needs to be the day before that. So
We should say maybe more realistically
Eric,
February.
you're shaking your head.
I'm just shaking my head that the last day, just, you know, in terms of getting the paperwork, is that's all I was not wanting to have the the jeopardy of not being able to actually get it filed. You know, we have another ice storm, we have a power outage, you know, and then we miss the deadline. That's all I was shaking my head
Right,
about.
and so realistically, that means that we've got to have this by the 26th to 28th of February.
We believe you that staff will be ready to make a recommendation for your consideration at your February 7th meeting. And we believe our stakeholder partners would be prepared to support you making a decision at that time.
I just wanted to add one additional piece of information that might be important, which is the earlier it can be referred, the more time there is to deal with any ballot title challenges that may come up.
Aha.
So just to keep that in mind, that could delay final publishing in the voter book. Yeah.
Thank you, Noah. Eric, did,
To know.
Excuse me, so I'm gonna ask anyone speaking to come closer to the table, and Mary Helen had her name up as well, so that the cross.
I just had my hand up to support what Nancy just put in chat about having it hard and we don't know who's speaking and some people you can hear and some you can't.
So
okay, thank
please
you.
identify yourself when you're speaking.
We'll have folks come to the table just to speak. Can you guys hear me clearly? Okay.
Yes,
I'm saying-
perfect.
Oh, great.
We're gonna give just a little bit of a test. Can you hear me okay?
How about me? You guys good hearing me?
Okay. There's
So those at the
Yes.
table that you can hear, you can't hear folks around the periphery of the room. Eric, did you want to continue?
Well, I had raised my hand in that I wanted to inquire as to what meeting we were, whether it was the work session day or the regular board meeting day, but you're talking about typically the work session day, what did you say, February 7th?
February 7th would be your staff's recommendation, depending on your deliberations.
Gotcha.
Emerald?
Yes, that's a good idea. And I think before we get into the details of why and what and why move, we should get into the substance of
Yeah.
that
We have
all that's
another-
occurred and sort of where we are, and so people can make fully informed choices.
We do have an agenda item ahead of that. That's
Oh.
important.
Eric?
So I was going to ask, do you need a motion to modify the agenda? Is that what you were looking for? Or do you just want consensus for us to do that?
I guess I'm asking, do I have anyone strongly opposed? If I do, we will move into a motion to see if we have support to do what I proposed. So I'll ask that now. Do I have anyone strongly opposed to the notion of, and I think Emerald's point is good, that we're gonna have a discussion about this regardless. And I think after you hear that information, that might inform your decision on this. So I don't know that, moving into a motion to actually change the agenda before we've doing that is necessary, but
I'm just looking for what you were needing.
yeah, I'm asking right now, is anybody strongly opposed to the notion of us reordering the agenda, not adopting the minutes from the last meeting, and having the fiscal year 23-24 item from Lori discussed first? Okay, hearing none. Let's do that. Let's move into, I'm sorry, Wendy, can you pull the modified agenda back up?
Oh, tiny little screens.
Okay, let's move into the fiscal year 23-24 year-end financial forecast, and that is Lori.
Thank you.
Sure.
Good afternoon. So today, as part of our planning for the budget process, we'll be reviewing the financial forecast for this current fiscal year 2023-24, as well as continuing to discuss our budget planning. We've got some time at the end of the presentation for questions if you have them. But for now, we'll just jump right in. Wendy, next slide, please. So in your package, you have the detailed version of the financial forecast for the current fiscal year, and this is a summary of that forecast. Beginning fund balance is projected to be higher than budget by $200,000. This is a result of lower spending than anticipated in the prior fiscal year. So those are audited numbers at this point. So we do know that we came into the fiscal year with a little bit more money than what we budgeted. Materials and services are projected to be $347,000 lower than budget. The costs for MCDD staff are projected to be lower than budget because of open positions in legal and less work for the urban district than anticipated from our engineering team. Outside legal expenses projected to be $50,000 higher than budget, but is offset by savings in general consulting. Election fees budgeted in the fiscal year 23-24 for board elections will not be incurred until the upcoming fiscal year 24-25. So there will be savings in election fees as well. Ending fund balance is projected to be $672,000 higher than budget, leaving us with some funds to carry forward into the upcoming year. Next slide, please. So as we discussed, materials and services in total are about $347,000 less than budget. Professional services is providing the savings with staffing costs lower than budget by $229,000 and election fees for board members below budget at $120,000. That $120,000 will need to be carried forward into the next fiscal year so that we can elect our new board members. Next slide, please. This slide shows our projected fiscal year-end fund balance. You can see that we're maintaining dollars in fund balance, which will provide some resources for us in the upcoming fiscal year. Next slide, please. So let's review where we're at on our planning to support your review of the budget. As you recall, we have a pretty tight timeline with the budget for this year because of the legislative action that's taking place in the short session. So we're working on two different versions of the budget, but we'll be coming forth with one of the two that will happen in April. So we have reviewed the assessment information and provided you with the conversation about rate changes and are looking at a 10% rate increase for the upcoming year. We've also gone through the cash flow analysis for the urban district and showed you that we had adequate cash to be able to operate the district in the upcoming year, as well as enough carry forward cash to operate in the following year. Coming up, we will be taking a look at the staffing forecast, as well as having conversation about cost of living adjustments and merit assumptions. And we'll also talk about some potential position ads that are proposed to be included in the urban budget should we go to the consolidated urban district. We also will be spending some time as a board evaluating options in that new responsibilities area. If you recall, our forecast is $500,000 in spending for that new responsibilities area, which encompasses environmental, equity, and cultural history. So that presentation and discussion is coming up for you as board members as well. Next slide, please. So this is our draft proposed budget priorities for the upcoming year. And we are actually proposing these priorities for all of our districts because we believe that these are really the areas that we need to be focusing on as we move into the consolidation to the urban district. First is, of course, our core mission, which is flood protection and prevention. Our employees are also priority, so they keep our operations going and provide flood protection for our district. Their safety is of utmost importance and should continue to be our priority. Getting the urban district up and running in order to address our funding issues and to streamline governance to allow further support of the hundreds of millions of dollars of capital that we're poised to receive is also a priority. And advancing the district's equity framework is also on our list as a focus for the upcoming year. So we're asking you to consider these priorities and provide us feedback in the discussion time that we have coming up. And as I said, we'll be presenting the same set of priorities to all of our districts as we start to walk through the budget process. And that is the end of my presentation. So if there are questions, happy to take those.
Thank you, Lori. Questions? Eric?
Yes, this is Eric Molinder. Let's go back to page 2 of your forecast. We're $100,000 favorable in loan proceeds, but we were capped at 1.2 million from the city. Why the difference?
What we realized that wasn't included in the budget is that the interest expense rolls into the balance payable in the loan. We're not paying back the interest expense for a budget basis that then is both a resource and expense on the budget. So it was just a difference in the accounting versus the budget basis.
Okay, and so where do we see $100,000 increase in debt service?
We had the interest expense in the budget, but we did not have the resource of it rolling into the debt balance.
Okay, so we accrued the 98,000 and it's just gonna roll into the balance because we haven't paid.
Correct. We don't have to.
So that's,
start
it's
paying.
really just a timing issue.
It's a timing issue.
Mary
Wendy?
Helen online.
Oh,
I'm raising my hand for the online.
yeah, thank you. Mary Helen.
Okay, I have a couple questions and I don't know if they need to be in order or not, but the your one. I had a question about protecting employee safety. I think it's of utmost importance, but does the insurance cover contractors through IGAs? So if we hire a contractor to do work on the levees, like inspect pipes or go out and do other work, how is that covered and is that factored in any way in the budget?
The contractors are required to carry their own insurance and
Okay.
would also be required to have workers' compensation insurance on the individuals that are employed by that company. So
Okay.
we do
I-
receive certificates of insurance from our contractors. So we do verify that they are carrying that coverage that they need to have to
Okay.
protect their employees.
That question just came from because we never or generally don't see contracts or who's hired for what reason. And so I just wanted to make sure because that can become a big issue in a lot of factors.
And Mary
my-
Helen, you do get a contract report every month in your packet, so you can see any sort of changes that we've made and the companies that we're contracting with.
I know that, but I didn't know if the part in the IGA included a requirement to request them to carry workman's comp and insurance. Because there have been IGAs done with the city that have not included that and gotten the city into $1 million lawsuits. So that was where my question came from.
Thank you.
Okay, so the other, another question I had was about the point under priorities, advancing the district's equity framework. And then that ties into evaluate options for new responsibilities for environmental equity and cultural history. I agree totally about the environmental, but I've always had issues with cultural and history positions when there are many qualified contractors out there that have done this work for years. And I have, instead of spending more money to recreate it within the new district, I have an understanding, but I didn't have the time after I got this packet to go back and look of when we discussed that. But I participate in a number of historic preservation projects with the state, am on boards, and I could give you a list of contractors that could do a job and we wouldn't have to recreate or start from the beginning, but we could have contracts with them to do the work that whatever you determine is needed beyond.
Mary
the-
Helen, I want to stop you to reserve time. All we've done is carried forward the board's decision to have $500,000 set aside for new mandates. And what we've told you is the board's going to have discussion and decisions to direct staff on how to deploy those dollars. So your concerns are premature. The board hasn't had that conversation and we're setting it up for you to have it.
Okay, so that's, I understood someone to say that we would discuss these. So when that point comes, I guess we'll have that discussion and how we use that money. But I don't know when that'll be, so.
Coming up.
If, and when we have to decide. So if it falls within the budget categories, then I can live with that timeline. It was not clear to me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Helen. Other questions, comments, discussion? Yeah, Brent?
Lori, I guess in regards to the two versions of the budget, if we already, if I recall correctly from the last meeting I was at in December, that we kind of already knew which way we were gonna hopefully go with which.
We're
budget.
not hearing whoever's speaking.
Mary Helen, sorry about that. So in regards to the two budgets that are potentially proposed, is there any way, because if I recall correctly from the last meeting, we kind of already are hoping with one direction to get the budget earlier in advance to review, because I remember that there was concerns about the short timeline regarding the budgets for the board review. If they're already prepared to get those in advance of April, or is there a reason that they can't be shared in advance of April?
They're not prepared because we don't know which budget we're going to be proposing. We're under Oregon local budget law. We can propose one budget. So I am preparing two, one that's $1.2 million and one that is a consolidation of all of our legacy district operations plus our new responsibilities. I will know when the state legislature makes a decision on our legislative changes, whether we are moving forward with a consolidated budget or whether we are continuing with the smaller implementation budget that we are under right now. So there isn't numbers ready for review. There will be numbers ready for review when we know which direction we're going, and it'll take me a little bit of time. It's a 150-page document if we do the consolidated budget, so it takes a little bit of time to pull it together.
Okay, I thought you had already prepared both versions and that.
Nope.
Okay.
Our staff have their templates right now and are starting to pull together budget requests. So we are very early in the process.
I saw Seth's hand up and then Eric.
So I just wanted to clarify on the last question. So once the two budgets are put together, will we have a chance to look at both of them early, or is it just going to be the one that comes at the meeting to approve the budget?
You will get one budget proposed, and that is coming in April. And then you will be asked to approve the budget on May 1st. April 18th is the board meeting where we're looking at the proposed budget. May 1st is the meeting that we are approving the budget. You will have the budget in your board packet 1 week prior to the April 18th meeting. If I am able to, if I know the direction that we're going prior to that, I will get the document out early. But at this point, I don't know when the legislative changes are going to be considered. So I can't tell you when I will be able to go in a direction. I am only allowed to issue one proposed budget.
And then my actual question is, we had discussed putting together an estimate of what the transition costs would look like as part of the budget process. And I had brought that up, I think, in early December, and I just wanted to see if that was something that was planned for inclusion in the budget materials we'll receive for the April meeting.
There were estimates of transition costs that were included in the forecast. They're not significant compared to the total budget, so we hadn't anticipated a separate discussion of those transition costs prior to looking at the proposed budget. We were looking at the more significant areas, the assessments, the $500,000 for the new responsibility, the staffing costs, which are a significant portion of our costs as well. So we don't have a presentation planned for the transition costs, but I can tell you it's not a lot. It's a little bit of temporary staff for the finance team and some records management as we start to close things down. There's not a significant amount of transition costs.
Okay, I just want to clarify. I know that there's not a significant number of costs dollar-wise, but we've had discussions about what's going to, once we get through the transition phase and don't need as much, that there would be additional resources a few years out based on changes in staffing and what the needs are. And that was what I was referring to, not necessarily the transition cost that's included in the forecast.
So right now I'm not working on an updated 5-year forecast. No, I'm working on budgets.
Okay, I'll go ahead and look at my previous comments from past meetings and send those to Steve and Jim for follow-up to see if that's something that can be included in the budget process. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. We'll look into that. Feel free to give me a call if you want to talk about it.
Eric and then Bob.
Yeah, so Eric Molander, just following up on Brent's question. In broad discussion, what we're looking at in the budget is something that is equivalent to the forecast of 16.7 if we get the legislative changes, and around 12.2 if we don't.
1.2
No. For all of the units.
for the legacy districts. There'll be
As well.
individual budgets for the
No,
legacy
but
districts.
in combination, that would be about 12.2, correct?
Yep.
Same as last year.
Yeah, same as last year.
All right, so Brent, that'll give you a sense of the order of magnitude of changes that we're gonna have with the legislative changes versus without.
But the consolidated budget will have other funds as well. So the general obligation bond fund, the capital spending under the general obligation bond. So it is not quite as simple as 16.7, but yeah,
Broadly speaking.
broadly speaking.
Eric, Bob.
I was just wondering, sorry to be late. You have very good security here in the airport.
Bob, can you speak up for those online, please?
Yes, so if I'm repeating something, I apologize, but I'm curious about the priorities. I don't see anything about the environment in here at all. Again, I mean, this has been chronic every step of the way. It's next year. So I'm curious if somebody could speak to why there's nothing environmental in these 4 priorities.
I'm gonna have to own that as an oversight, and I think it's because our team is really trying to embed our environmental thinking in all we do. But I think that's a good point, Bob, and I want to be accountable to the board for that. And I approved those and initiated those priorities, and it was an oversight on my part. I appreciate you bringing it up.
Okay, thank you.
So Eric Molander, just following up on that, we're on a pretty tight timeline for the watershed plan. And right, and so if we don't start it in 25, we lose in effect a year in getting that started. And that's one of the very few things that we've got a requirement around. And I would like the staff to at least acknowledge, are there pieces of that watershed plan that we can get started on in 24, 25?
The answer is yes, and we're
Thank
having
you.
some internal conversations about how to scope that and engage the board in the development of that scope.
Thank you.
Yes.
Wendy. Oh, Mary Helen.
I just had a question because I heard Bob say my name and environmental, and I wanted to clearly understand what he said because I support all his issues. I just was reading from the advanced planning to support board budget review slide that said environmental equity and cultural history.
So
I was
that's
having
the-
a hard time hearing you at the beginning, Bob, but I kind of heard my name, so I thought I better ask.
there were 2 points that Bob made. We clearly have some budget in the forecast for the new mandates that include the environment. Bob was referring to the budget priorities in the presentation, which do not reference environmental improvement, and that's on.
Oh, okay. No, I support that as well, but okay, thanks.
Other discussion, questions, comments? We're not looking for any board action on this item. This was for your information. So again, this is your chance to get your questions answered. If you have follow-up questions though, you can always email those over to Jim and I, and we're happy to get those answered for you.
I guess I would just close this discussion if there isn't questions or more discussion from the board to acknowledge that about a year ago, we were really worried we weren't going to have enough money. And thanks to leadership from the board and Lori and our team and some vacancies, we've managed the dollars really tightly, and it's going to leave us with some extra cash. So I want to appreciate the board's support for those actions and to the team for really working hard to conserve dollars.
Thanks. Okay, well, We are gonna move on in the agenda to leave plenty of time here for discussion about the geo bond. And I'll just turn that over to Jim this time.
Yeah, so thanks. If you want to pull up the slides, Wendy? Or,
I did email them.
Okay, I will get those.
well, machine. I think well, I'm gonna wait for the slides. Otherwise, I'll get ahead of myself.
And the slides are not in the packet that went out in advance, correct?
They are not.
Okay. I won't shuffle pages looking for something that's not there.
No, we were making changes at 12:15 today, so
Not a problem. The pixels are still wet.
that's right. Thank you, Wendy.
Dollar amount associated? Yeah. Well, let's ask that now. So while we're bringing this up, we have time for a miscellaneous question from Brent about, in the board packet, talking about contracts needing board approval. Some of them do and some of them don't. I think that's a dollar amount association.
100,000.
Okay. 100,000 and above requires board approval.
And the board can change that whenever it wants. And there are going to be some contracts below that we will probably bring you just because of their nature, so.
I'm having trouble opening it in the app, so.
Oh, I can probably call it up and just not use the slides.
If you can call it up, you may be able to share your screen.
Can I ask a quick question here then about what Steve just said? The total amount of contracts per contractor or per district? The 100,000?
Per contract.
For individual.
Okay, so if we give a contract to a contractor and the different districts are charged different amounts of money, you add all those up and it should be under 100,000?
Per contract, Mary Helen. Per
One example is J&M,
Per
who
organization.
does pipe
contract
inspections.
per district. We do a separate contract for each district. Per
Okay,
district.
Does that make sense?
okay. Yeah, so each contract has to be under 100,000.
Right. But
No, each contract that is over 100,000 has to come to the board.
Okay, sorry, I misspoke.
that's okay. I think I think we answered your question. If not, let me know. All right, you got it up there? Thanks. So as you guys know, let's go to the next slide. We're working hard to get this thing out the door. I want to remind you where we left off, which was that's going to be the first thing we talk about. I'm going to highlight some new information, opportunities and challenges that have emerged since your last meeting. And we're going to go over some proposed bond revisions that are in your packet and some potential revisions that I need you guys to consider and give staff direction on. And then we'll have a discussion. So next slide, please. So last time, what we talked about after you gave us some direction was a $195 million package. You saw a draft resolution with a ballot title and a draft staff report. And on the 14th of December, which was just a couple of days after the governor and the downtown task force called for a moratorium on new fees and taxes, I asked you to consider delaying your vote so that we could do some groundwork with those key stakeholders on their position. And so we've been doing those conversations and we'll report out briefly here on that. I want to remind you that our objective is still to have you guys refer a measure for the May 2024 ballot. That's our goal. Next slide, please. And one after that. One more. And so what you received in your packet, which is before the pixels got wet and are still drying, was some minor changes to the ballot title and the resolution and the staff report. And those are based on some feedback that we received from the Secretary of State on our communication materials. You may recall that we committed to sending our publicly financed information through the Secretary of State's office to get safe harbor. While we didn't send the actual ballot title, we got feedback on some very similar language from the Secretary of State's office. And so we've incorporated some of that feedback into the draft materials that you have in your packet. We also made a few small revisions after some additional editorial review, just for clarity and consistency, nothing substantive. So again, what you're seeing in terms of changes really reflects some feedback and advice we got from the Secretary of State about how to avoid advocacy with public resources. Next slide, please. I don't think I need to remind you, but I'm going to anyway, that the objectives of our bond are to really manage flood risk, and that includes providing the local match for the federal investment through the Portland Metro Levee System Project. It includes upgrading and improving our levees to meet the new federal standards. It calls for really investments that are going to create a comprehensive flood safety system across the floodplain. And it will also help us improve our capabilities around emergency response. The other aspect that's critical for this bond, and I'll reflect on my error in not including it in our key budget objectives, is to advance ORS 550 and the mission, vision, values that this board has adopted. That includes environmental work, it includes water quality, it includes climate resilience, cultural history, and equity. And so all of the projects are guided by outside bond counsel and our financial advisors to ensure we're meeting legal and accounting rules on what projects can be implemented legally with public bond funds. Next slide. It's in my own so I can see it. So now we get to the fun part and the interesting part, the new opportunities and challenges. As you recall, on the 14th, I asked you to delay because of the moratorium on new fees and taxes. We heard at that time that there was likely funded opposition to a ballot measure at $195 million from members of the downtown task force and the governor. So we've engaged in some discussions with the members of the task force and the governor's office over the last several weeks about why our measure is different and why it warrants evaluation by the governor and the task force to go through there despite their moratorium. We also, in engaging the governor, achieved a shared commitment from the task force members and the governor to seek additional state grant funds and a low interest loan from Business Oregon to supplement our capital program. And it resulted on Thursday of last week in the task force and the governor's office sending us a proposal for a bond measure at $125 million. That proposal was offered unto us with a shared commitment to seek state grant funds and an offer to endorse our measure. Staff got together and really worked hard to make $125 million work. And we're going to explain to you what we can do for $125 million. We also got back to the task force and the governor's office and said 125 is going to be challenging. And so we requested their consideration of an alternative of 150 million. Yes, Bob.
I'm just curious, you keep talking about the task force members. Can you tell us who was negotiating on behalf of the task force? Who's in that room? Because I understand it was a PBA.
It was PBA and other members of the task force, yeah. So the port was there, city was there, county was there. I remember some of you were there.
But I think the city and the port were negotiating on kind of our behalf, as I understand it. But
correct.
The PBA was negotiating.
Yeah, there was a cast of dozens of task force members that are also PBA members. So
okay, thanks.
I don't have a list in front of me, but we could probably pull one together.
That's fine. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Eric?
Just was curious, was there a specific reason that they proposed 125?
Thank you. Good question. We provided them with a lot of the cash flow details that we've shared with lots of you and with the Corps. Their objective, of course, is they have deep concerns about the rate and size of taxes in our region. And their goal was to try and come up with a number that would ensure that the only bond projects that were advanced at this time were those directly related to obtaining the federal match and accreditation. And they came up with a number of 125 to accomplish that. And we do think there's a pathway to doing that, but we think it's tight. And so we did our estimates and looking at potential investment from the state of $30 to $40 million. We have to go through the legislature to get those things. We can go into some detail about the tactics we think are viable there. At $150 million, that gets us to about $190 million, which is pretty close to what you guys were working at. So what I'd like to do now is just remind you that As of today, there was a meeting of the task force members, and what we heard back from them, again, like at about 12:15 today, was that at $125 million, they are supportive and they will endorse the measure. At $150 million, they were neutral. They reserve the right to see, they want to see the bond documents before they can finalize their decision. And so your options before you today are to go at 195, to go at 150, or to delay and have more conversations with the chamber. And so I'm looking forward to hearing your discussion. But before you get into that discussion, I think it would be valuable for you to hear from Colin and Lori. I think it's mostly Colin, who's going to walk through the 150 and 125 scenarios just to see what we think we can do and what the risks and opportunities there are. But again, this is your decision. And again, Bob, you weren't here, but I think we would all benefit from not having a vote today to settle and give you guys time to think about what we've put on the table and discuss it and find out where you really want to be. And I would recommend that we come back on February 7th for a real vote. Steve?
Bob's hand was up first.
I mean, I guess I want to make sure I just fully understand this, because we've spent 13 years getting to this point, and a year working through this. We've hired consultants, we've had surveys, we've had pollings, we've had endless discussions. But the downtown task force now is pretty much replacing this board, as I hear you describe it, and coming up with their own analysis of this work, their own number, and telling us what that should be. That just seems startling to me, that anybody would have that level of arrogance to come in and say, you know, we're going to take your numbers, analyze them for you, and basically tell you what you will do. Am I misreading that, Jim, or is that what happened? Because it sounds to me like the work we've done for the past 11 months was just nullified.
I understand why you would characterize it that way. I would recharacterize it slightly differently. And what I heard consistently through the process was everyone acknowledging this was an important project and we needed full funding to do all of the work. The concern coming from the task force in the governor's office was that the circumstances right now are challenging. Do you need all that money right now? And is there a way to get the state to kick in more so that Multnomah County didn't have to pay as much as they're paying?
Is the governor guaranteeing that?
Governor can't guarantee it any more than we can guarantee the federal match, because it requires acts of the federal and state legislature.
Okay. Thank you.
And the governor's office made that clear. At the same time, I will share that since we made the initial call, Business Oregon has been terrific. So again, no guarantees. I want to be really clear with you about that.
There's
Hands up on the screen.
Yeah, I think
Steve's
Eric
calling on
was
people.
first. I could be wrong, but I see Eric and I see Seth and I see Mary Helen, but let's go with Eric first.
Jim, I just wanted to clarify, earlier on, there was mention that, you know, there was potentially a number of, that we would get support, a number that was neutral, and a number that was opposed, would there be opposition? So I'm assuming what you had just mentioned, the support at 125, neutral at 150, I'm assuming active opposition at 195, is that?
I didn't hear that today, but I had heard it earlier.
Yep.
So I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I think there was fairly consistent message that there was deep concern at 195. And so I would share that they're having released some of this information when I first received it. I know there's concerns on this board about the lower number as well. So I want to be really candid that you guys have some decisions to make here.
I know Jim has more slides to get through. I guess I'll ask before I go to Seth. Is it beneficial to finish your presentation up, or are we at a good place for you to continue to take?
I guess what
Questions.
the next steps in the presentation include a description of how staff would manage at 125 with the state revenue.
So before we get there,
and
that's
150 with
yeah.
the state revenue.
Yeah.
So you can see what we believe is accomplishable at those numbers and what it would take to complete accreditation and the program that you guys are supporting.
So Seth, if your question doesn't have to do with getting into the details of what those numbers mean, then go for it.
Yeah, my question is, just wanted to know if the conversations with the state and that grant funding was tied specifically to any project. And the one I'm thinking of is, were they trying
No
to size
project
it so that that's not meant to be the local match share of the PMLS projects?
maybe I cut you off too soon and didn't understand your question. It was, the overall number was the issue, not any individual project.
Yes, but the question is the state kicking in money. They're not kicking in any money. They're kicking in money towards the total. It's not specific to just the PMLS or any of the required projects by the Army Corps or FEMA. It's for the entire bond.
That's correct.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
So at this point, I think I'd like to turn it over to Colin to go over the 150 and 125 scenarios, and then I think we can get into a healthy discussion. Before we do that, I want to be clear with you all that I know this was a little bit unprecedented, and I was operating a little bit without a net. I did not get pushed one way or another by any board members, and just did my best to facilitate a conversation to find out where the chamber and governor were coming from. If I erred in not consulting any of you, I am solely accountable for that. And I want you to know.
Mary Helen, you were next.
I think mine's just a quick one and I might have missed it, but what's the FEMA deadline? We keep hearing FEMA deadline. Is there a date that we have to get this money by to get the FEMA match?
I think the most critical deadline that we shared with these key stakeholders was April of 2025. The district needs to sign a financial capabilities commitment letter. And in that letter, we have to be able to demonstrate with complete confidence that we can make the entire local match. And that was a key factor in stakeholders saying, okay, we probably need to compromise on this and get it through the moratorium.
So it's not tied to the federal budget. It's FEMA. If FEMA doesn't get funded, federal budget's not approved, all those kinds of things, their budget's reduced at the federal level, but that FEMA allocation, accreditation, whatever it gets called in the documents, is in place till April 2025.
No, we need enough money in the bank to be able to sign a financial commitment letter to be able to make the local match by April of 2025. Or
Okay.
walks.
I was
Or
just trying to get a time frame. Yeah,
Because over and
because
above that, we still have 50 million or so that's associated with getting FEMA accreditation.
Right.
But we need to have a local match of 35% of $160 million in the bank by April of 2025.
Not in the bank, but we have to know that we can receive it.
Correct. So we can take it out in tranches in the bond, but we've got the authority to raise that money.
Yeah.
Firm funding source.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you for that clarification, Eric.
And I think this is Colin, Rowan, and I think really importantly, the FEMA is not planning to come in and remap while we're active in the federal project.
Correct.
And so if we aren't able to meet those deadlines, then FEMA needs to go through the process of remapping and then the sort of loss of accreditation.
Emerald was next.
Just to remark that having been, you know, in the room in a number of these conversations, staff can't toot their own horn, but I can. Staff did a remarkably good job being clear and concise and concrete about the needs of the district, the financial needs, must-haves, and representing the interest of this board, but stopping short of acting on the board's behalf. Okay, so I just want to make it that very, very, very clear that staff has been responsive, providing information objectively to a lot of people with very conflicting interests. And it has at times felt like an impossible situation. So this has been a very hard series of meetings. And I want to commend staff for doing a really good job and also making it very clear the powers of this board.
Thank you, Emerald. Eric? And then I'm going to ask that we let Jim and Colin finish the presentation. Oh.
Thought Eric was saying this. Sorry. I just wanted
There's going to be more opportunity for discussion, questions, comments, but I do want to let these guys get through the information they were trying to get through. So let's go for it.
All right, Colin, over to you.
All right, thank you. I am going to quickly summarize the two packages that we have worked on. So the first one is a $150 million package. When do you think Next slide, please. So just want to highlight what is in these two alternative packages and how we get there. And then we can dig deeper if you have any questions. I'll just kind of hit the highlights of it. So $150 million package, all of the projects that you had previously seen in your last package at 195 are in there and fully funded. The big difference is the inclusion of state grant funding. And so 10 million of that 30 to 40 state grant funding comes from the existing levy grant program that Business Oregon has. And so we would be looking at about $1 million a year over 10 years, and then looking for a request or multiple requests of the Capital Construction Committee for a larger request of about $20 to $30 million. So the package also includes work that we've been doing led by Lori Baker with Business Oregon to have the initial tranche be paid for by or covered by a Business Oregon loan. And so that is a low or no interest loan. The important part of that is it allows us to not issue the debt initially, so it delays and that helps some of the concerns around the moratorium. It also allows us to establish more of a credit history, so it improves credit rating and gives us a little bit of leeway to get started. The package also will require us reducing our administrative overhead. So of course, that's one of the risks there. And so that is a reduction of about $5 million. So with the 150 plus the 40 from the state, we get to basically the same package. Of course, the state funding does require appropriations from the state, but we are looking for having strong support from state leadership as well as our own delegation in Salem. So let me go right into the $125 million package, and we can dig into these after I review them. The next slide, please. So with this lower number, staff sees more risks. And so in this package, we have almost all of the same projects and funding levels, but it does require more from this multi-source funding approach. So we still have the initial funding, a loan from Business Oregon to get us going. It still includes $30 to $40 million in grant funding, same as that previous package. It further reduces the administrative overhead. And I think one other piece that's key is it moves one of our projects, the slope resurfacing, levee slope resurfacing, into operating capital. It's still a necessary project, but it's a project that can be broken up over a number of years and be done through our operating capital. And it further reduces the administrative costs. The additional piece that is not in that $150 million package is that we will have about 16.5 million of this that either needs to be accomplished through additional grants or private borrowing. So full faith and credit borrowing for a portion of that. And so there are a number of projects that in any of these scenarios, we're going to be seeking additional FEMA grant dollars. But anything that we can't buy down the total cost out of grant dollars, we in this package would require us using a commercial loan. So that has a cost and comes with greater risk. The lower administrative number means that we just will have to be really careful. Lori's done the analysis and feels confident we'd be able to manage into it, but it does mean that there's less contingency and less wiggle room there to be able to get
More to the general fund.
Yep.
You also have the right to go back out for another measure, but that's complicated and expensive, and it'll be challenging with our operating revenue.
So how much is the interest savings at 125 and 150?
I don't know that we have a calculation for that, to
No,
be
we don't.
honest. Sorry, yeah, it's too fresh.
We have the dollars per thousand, but we
Yeah,
don't
it's
have the.
goes
savings.
from about 9 cents a thousand to just under 11 cents a thousand. It's 9 cents at 125 and just under 11 at 150 and 14 at 195.
I see Eric and then Seth.
Colin, the 10 million or so that would be the Business Oregon loan, but the potential source. I'm assuming that is gonna have to be, that debt service is then is ultimately gonna have to be made out of operating revenue
No,
rather than general obligation bond?
general obligation bond, it would just be the first tranche of the debt, general obligation bond. So we would have to get the bond referral authorized by the voters. And we've talked to the state about that already. So, but the debt service can be paid through the property taxes. It'd just be another tranche of the GO bond.
We have to use the loan for capital purposes that qualify for bond payment, which we would do anyway, but.
So the terms change, but we are looking at the Special Public Works Fund, and they often do have a certain amount of time where it's zero interest and then it ramps up, and there's, you know, it depends, but it's a very low interest loan, usually under 2%. And the ideal would be that we pay it off right away.
So.
Yeah, just two questions. So it looks like the proposal to get to 125, the only project you're suggesting we don't do with the bond funds is the levee slope resurfacing.
I think though we would need to go get that private debt to complete both Schmier Road, PIR local match for FEMA, and some other projects as well. So the out year construction costs would need additional revenue.
And what we're looking at with our forecast for the urban district is there is a time period where we're paying about $1.5 million a year to pay back the city of Portland for the borrowing that we've done for operations. What we're thinking is that the timing of the need for this general fund borrowing to make up the difference would fall at the end of that payment stream. So we would have room within our budget so that level of debt service would just continue on. It would just be covering this borrowing on the general fund that shores up the package to make sure that all the projects get done. So it obviously would be a decision of the board when we get to that point. We're talking about years 6 through 10 on the project plan, on the cash flow. So a lot can change between now and then, but that type of borrowing would require board authorization prior to getting the borrowing.
We do
Okay,
be required to finish off the accreditation work.
So the levee slope resurfacing is a required project for the FEMA and Army Corps of Engineers
It is not.
certification.
It's a nice thing to have. And again, what we're proposing for that work is to move it into our operating capital column.
And not to speak for Bill, but we did ask him to take a look at the project list and let us know the lowest risk project. And he has repeatedly said this would be the one that he would shift, and we would be able to segregate it between years and include it in our regular operating capital.
Okay, so I want to clarify what the ask is from the board, because it sounds like the plan is that through reducing program admin, tapping operating expenses, and looking at other grant programs, the project list would remain the same, just the financing mechanisms would be different. So what you're asking us to essentially do what? Not trim the project list, but to approve going forward and kind of figure it out however you guys can? Kind of what's the ask for clarification from the board?
So you guys have a decision to make about what level of bond you want to refer. What we're telling you is that 125, we think with some additional borrowing, we can get the job done, but it increases risk to our general fund. It reduces our ability to manage the projects. It's really, really tight. And it requires additional borrowing in the future. At 150 with the state funds, it's easier because we're closer to the original number. And then you also have the option of going with your original plan of 195.
So should we
give us direction?
Should we then assume that the difference between the 125 and the 150, that $25 million of additional capital, would need to be bonded against the operating revenue, and how much annually would we be looking at?
We think with we think at 150 with the state funding, the $5 million reduction is doable.
No, the question is with the general fund borrowing. I was looking at a 10-year payback and the borrowing would happen in years 6 through 10. And it was about $1.4 million a year with a 10-year payback for that general fund borrowing. That would just slot right in after we pay off the city of Portland, and it's about the same amount that we're having to pay back to the city of Portland. So our debt service, where we were looking at those years 6 through 10 having kind of a decline in debt service where we could shift dollars either to reserves or some other purpose within our general fund budget, would continue on to cover the debt service that would be necessary to fill out the funding package if we're not able to find grant funds to fill in for that 16.5 million.
But to clarify, that's, I believe, only true at 125. At 150, we don't
Yes.
believe that additional borrowing would be required.
No, 150 gets us whole with a reduction to administrative expense. There are not bond issuance costs or other administration on that piece of the funding from the state. So there's a reduction there, but it also does give us a little bit less contingency to operate with. So it's a reduction to the overall administrative allowance that was included in the 195 million.
And then obviously at 195 million, we don't need any additional state funds. We don't need any additional borrowing.
Yeah, and so I'm still trying to wrap my head around what the ask is. So there's a $25 million difference between the 125 and the 150. And so what I want to clarify, Laura, you said in years 6 through 10, you'd add $1.4 million for 10 years to pay back that 25 million and grab the money that had.
No, what we looked at was to make that package balance 125 plus the money from the state. We reduced the administrative allocation, so we reduced the amount that we would be able to have to support the program administratively. And we are estimating between 12 and 16.5 million dollars worth of general fund borrowing that would need to occur, and that's about a $1.4 million payback over 10 years. It could be that the board decides to pay that back over 20 years, which would be, a lower annual amount, but I calculated it on over 10.
Nancy? Oh, sorry.
More questions?
I'll go ahead and type a question in the comment and we can come back to it.
Thanks, Seth.
So to me, this looks like there's a bit of a silver lining in that we're getting significant state funds. I think that's good. And from what I understand, that 30 to 40 million in state grant funds is not a loan, right? So that's good. I mean, these levies are of statewide significance as well as regional significance. With that said, and I'm not sure about the reduced program administration. It makes me nervous because that's where everyone tries to reduce. And then when you are when it's too skeleton, then it starts being expensive because you're not able to make, process improvements. And you just have to keep going. So I'm a little nervous about for the long term, but okay, so I think the 150 sounds like it's the same, except that instead of so much GeoBond, we get state funding. It's also an if, because what if that doesn't eventuate? That's a real problem, because our operating budget at 16.7 is, I believe, too low for the long term. Very concerned. That's what we agreed to. Okay. The GeoBond, we'd sort of come down to 195, even though we needed more. It's okay. So the whole thing where we're bringing it down and down and down, really, I think it jeopardizes the long-term sustainability, even the short-term sustainability of what we're trying to do. So at this point, I'm hearing that it's just, like Seth mentioned, actually, it's state grants plus the GeoBond were kind of the same on the 150 version.
More risk.
More risk if we don't get those state grant funds. That's a big risk. So, okay. And then the this has come up before, the shop. That's, has that been changed in the, like the $18 million shop,
No.
which is not a shop? It's a really excellent emergency communications and operational piece of facility, but that's in no matter what.
Yes. That maybe, again, the private borrowing needed to complete all the projects under the $125 million. So no.
Okay, well, I would just urge us, this is a big thing. This is a change after 100 years of governance. Hopefully this can last for 100 more years and not just like 20 years. It's connected to the Columbia River Treaty. It's connected to the movement of the Columbia River all up and down, and we're the people trying not to get flooded. So I would urge us to be mindful of the wider impacts as we go forward. And to me, that means 195 or 150. So at this point in our discussion. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Nancy. I have Bob, Brent, and then Eric.
I really appreciate the work of staff over the last year. And I appreciate the work we've had to do over the last week. I don't see a silver, I see smoke and mirrors. We spent a year going through this in detail. Now we're going to throw that work out. We're going to make all kinds of changes. We were nervous about 195 in terms of having the capacity to really do the full mandate of this district. Now we're talking about a $75,000 reduction. Or $75 million, sorry, yeah, I wish, that we have never even considered. That has never, 150 and 125 have never even been discussed. And now after a year of work, we're gonna make a whole lot of changes. We're gonna count on $40 million from the state that might or might not materialize. We're gonna reanalyze all the projects. We're gonna move stuff around. We're gonna put stuff into the operating budget, which I agree is too small. We're gonna make all these great changes, and so it turns out we can do it at 125. Who knew? That's a joke. That's a joke. And I look at this from the perspective of somebody who has been here for 13 years, and I got involved because I wanted to make sure that we did something other than 1950s style flood management, that we actually did green and environmental justice and climate resilience. And when we did the Corps of Engineers $100 million grant program, they didn't include any of those things. And we were told, don't worry, we can take their $100 million, but we'll do it in the budget and we'll do it in the bond measure that's coming. And then we got to the budget. Turns out that we really couldn't do it in the budget because it had to come down, and we kind of skimped and we barely got there, but don't worry, we'll get to it in the ballot measure. So now here we are, we're at the ballot measure, and now we're being told, hey, don't worry, we'll get to it through these smoke and mirrors and these manipulations and hope and pray that we get some money over here and that this works out and that works out. I don't buy it. Honestly, I think what will happen is what's happened every step of the way for 13 years, and that is the environment and the environmental justice and the climate resiliency will fall off the side. When push comes to shove at 125 or 150, we simply will not get there. And we won't meet the mandates of this district. When we go out and we talk to the public, we talk about these great new mandates and our commitment to it, but the fact is we're not. And so I am at 195. I think we put in the work and the time. I think it's the behest of this board to go back to the governor, to the Portland Business Alliance, who, by the way, went behind closed doors and came out with this mandate of no new taxes. They didn't include community members in that. It was a business community and the governor. And they went behind closed doors and they dumped this mandate on the community. And now we're trying to respond to it without any consideration of whether it really made sense for things like this, because this is different. So I guess my question to you, and I don't mean to put staff on the spot, but why should we believe, after being told for so long that the finances were different, that suddenly in a week we've cut this thing by 75 million and we can still do it?
I would say we haven't cut it. What we've done is found other options for revenue.
We found hopes and prayers, but we haven't found other options.
And we've tried to be really honest with you about the risk of pursuing state funding.
Right, but I just look at that and I don't. Why did we put in 13 years? I mean, some of you are newer than that, but I was here from the beginning. Why have we put in this much time to suddenly turn everything on its head in the last week. And I understand the politics of it, but I think the appropriate thing to do is to fight, not to cave. And I think the PBA is bluffing because no one stands to lose more from this than the PBA and their clientele. We have many people on this board who are members of the PBA. And in the same way that I go to the environmental community and try to pull them in, I expect PBA members to pull the PBA in. They haven't shown up once in 13 years, not once. And my hope and my expectation and my understanding was that the members of the PBA who were on this board were patrolling their own. And I guess that didn't happen. And that's sorely disappointing after this much time, this much energy. And when we're on the precipice of doing something, it's a very big lift. We don't have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of, we have a lot of work, and we're going to turn this thing upside down, inside out, backwards, and empty it out at the last minute. I think that's crazy.
Right. Sure. Tough to follow. So my question, going back to the changes in the classifications from the slope levy as a capital project to a operating, was just wondering how that change in classification occurred. Trying to think about this from a bond perspective.
It's not a change in classification. We have dollars in our regular operating budget for capital spending in the general fund. And so what we're saying is those projects would shift and be part of that capital spending in the general fund.
Okay.
So it was little under $1.9 million in total on the project list for that levee slope resurfacing. And what we're saying is, since that's a multiple year, that would fit within the operating capital that's been forecast for the district. So it's not changing it from capital to operating.
Because I guess I'm in agreement of a lower bond amount, because I see that the cost of a bond gets pushed on to voters and to business owners. So I like the idea of seeing additional funding from the state and the other agencies sharing in the cost, because this is something that is of regional importance. And so the one thing we can count on is voters having to pay for things. So I understand the 195 and would like to hear your concerns as well in this regard too, but I guess I would be on the opposite end of Bob's.
Eric?
I guess I want to clarify from a risk standpoint, what I'm understanding is that both the 125 package and the 150 package, we have penciled in the expectation of $30 to $40 million from the state. Is that correct?
Correct.
So in my mind, that's a risk with either package, given the legislature and their many maneuverings and compromises that have to be made. It's, not a process where any one person can commit to us, and, as best intentions on the part of whatever committee or chairperson there might be, they ultimately can't say that, well, we're going to give you $4 million a year over the next 5 biennium, and, we'll guarantee that. So I get a little concerned about that risk, because, if we were at 125 and then we, don't get that 30 to 40, I think we're going to be in a real dire circumstance. The other part that makes me real nervous is somewhat of what Nancy was talking about. Is I get nervous about, yes, it's always good to cut administrative expense. I'm all for efficiency and so forth. My concern is we have to have enough project management capacity, whether that's explicitly a project manager on a construction project is one thing, but just overall managing the whole range of all of what has to be implemented for this process overall, it requires capable, dedicated people that we have to have the resources to be able to employ. And it makes me real nervous that, we're not going to be able to afford to have that professional capability that's necessary to be able to execute on it. I mean, it's unfair to try and accomplish all of it without the adequate resources. So I'm real nervous about how much of that reduction, and so I'm very reluctant to do the 125 at all. And it makes me sad that if the PBA is going to be neutral over it, because I would agree, I think their constituency is going to be a great beneficiary of ultimately of the projects, but I understand their perspective on wanting to push for the lowest cost for their constituents. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure I understood the risks correctly.
Thank you, Eric. I have Mary Helen, Ashton, and Seth.
I totally agree with Bob. What Bob said is that we've invested in 13 years because Bob and I think Corky, I don't know if anybody else in the room, started that first day with Levy Ready Columbia, and it's been 13 years. We've seen a vast amount of change, and the people at the table that changed are the politicians or government representatives and business interest who shift around. The people that represent causes like Bob and environmental justice. I've tried to represent neighborhoods, and those are where all my questions have come from. So I kind of come at this from about the same direction that Bob does, is that we need to protect the interests of who truly is affected. And I think that's been lost in the conversation. Politicians change every 2 years, 6 years, 10 years, 12 years, but and for those in the room, they need to be able to answer to their constituency, and they need to be able to say why things happen. And I think that they do that in their best interest as well as the constituents. And I have a difficult time with not recognizing how that affects the people that would be most affected by a flood, and that would be my neighbors. And I say neighbors of anybody in the floodplain. So I've not heard in the conversation any of how that will affect them. They still ask the questions about what will it cost, and I didn't see any of that in the presentation of how will it change, because there are renters low, and we talk about equity of low income underrepresented folks. There's a lot of those people out there that we've not addressed what it would cost them. And I feel strongly that we need to look at, yes, who will benefit and where are we going to get the money from, but we also need to identify through an equity lens of who's most affected. And Bob's idea of or suggest or cause is environmental justice, and environmental changes to the habitat will greatly affect the equity. So that ties, those two tie together. I just wanted to make that we keep that in focus, that the voters are the ones that are going to fuel how they do that. The administrative expense, I've puzzled for a long time because I've been involved in these issues of, and I think it's been brought up before, there's been a complete staff turnover, and the administration costs have gone from, and I forget the numbers, but to now, is it 31 employees or somewhere in that number? Plus we have all the contracts. And so are we paying contractors to do the work, or who would be most affected by the administrative reduction, contractors or employees? And how do those costs fluctuate with the 25 million to 50 million and the saying that program administration would be reduced? It's been increased greatly in the last several years. And so I'd like maybe Lori or somebody, and you can answer me another time and I'll be quiet in the middle. But the professional capabilities are prior years, through reading this ballot measure, one of the things I was concerned about is that it was saying that we are left with failing, aging, or underperforming pump stations. Well, what did the drainage districts do for the previous 100 years? Is that's what we have now? And is that what's the cause of all this? I don't know how to answer that to people, because that's the question that neighborhood meetings, my government groups that I meet with, all ask, well, what did they do with our money before, and why are they all failing, aging, and underperforming? And I can't answer that. So I hope that somehow that, I'm going to say, social aspect, environmental aspect gets addressed, as opposed to who's going to get money. And then it's all about money. It's effect. I saw your note, Jim, about 9 cents per thousand. And I've said this before and everybody can say it about me. I'm not an accountant, so I'll leave that to Eric Molander and Tanny because they know the finances, they know the budgets, and they can figure that out. So I think we need to look at the humanity of this as well as the dollars in the pockets and where it's going to come from.
Thanks, Mary Helen. Ashton?
Thank you. Very good conversation. And I first want to start off by thanking the staff for all the time and effort they put into getting us here to this point. I know my predecessor, Councilor Craddock, sat at this table with you all, Mary Helen and Bob, for a long time. And so I picked this up last year, and I do want to uplift what Bob and both Mary Helen said, particularly about environmental justice and the cultural history that is a part of this mandate to go into this work, which I feel like would get value engineered out. Hold on 1 second, son. Hold on. I think it's pretty irresponsible for the Portland Metro Chamber to put us in this position. And it's pretty thuggish behavior to have us at the last hour contorting ourselves around numbers that we haven't had time as a body to fully respond to absorb, to ask more deep dive questions. And I don't think that's the kind of partnership myself or Metro wants to have with folks, especially considering this is safety and resiliency. This is a 100-year project. This is a once in a lifetime project. But I get it. We got to do better on process because we've gone through this process for a year now, a whole year. And if I'm not mistaken, we've tried to reach out to the PMC and they did not respond back to us. Even though there's people on this body, a part of the PMC, and for them to hide behind the governor and the task force and cut us off at the knees right before a vote, that's just irresponsible. But right now, I get it. We need to make a sound decision. Now, with that said, staff came back with a 195 baseline because they know the work that goes into it. And I just want to say this, as a service member, as a veteran, we do the same things in the military. We have our staff come up with a budget, our commanders approve it, it gets pushed up and it gets approved and we get to push forward. That's why we are the greatest military on this planet, because we don't allow external forces to come in and disrupt the business or the mission at hand. And right now, the mission at hand is critical and it's about to die, because right now we are allowing an external factor process to get in the way of all the work that we did. And I'll be honest, I don't like my time wasted, because my time is your time. It's government time. And those same folks that plaster our faces on billboards, those same folks that say government spending is out of control, just wasted an entire year of our time. That said, again, sound decision has to be made. We got to make sure we do this right. I am not supportive of 125. That just puts us at too much of a risk liability. I'm sorry. 150, we could swing, but 195 is what was put in front of us as the thing that is going to make sure that this is done right. And I think that that is also the piece, is that we get it done right. That said, you can move on to the next person. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashton. We're on Seth and then we're on Corky.
Hi, I just want to ask Jim, what I heard was that we are going to spend $95 million on projects. Whether that comes from the GEO bond, the state, or financed out of operating revenue, the plan that you're presenting is that we are going to spend $195 million. We're not planning on cutting any projects. We're not planning on gutting our environmental projects. We are still planning on spending the $195 million. The question is, how do we get the $195 million? Is that what you guys are proposing?
think it's not quite that clean, because at 150, we're proposing 190, not 195. And at 125, I don't have the total, but it's less.
It's less because of the reduction in administrative.
So they're not equivalent. And
Well,
he gets lost in the same projects we hope will get done. But it's tighter across the board at the lower number.
no, and to speak to Eric's concern about project management, my assumption was that if you're not billing the geo bond for those project management and administrative costs, that will have to be picked up by the general fund budget. You're not just going to not do the work. You're just going to change. It's going to be paid for out of our general fund and operating dollars and not billed to the bond. It's not that we're not going to do it. It's that how we pay for it is different. And so I think
that's the key, right?
yeah, same with but is that an accurate summary of what you guys are proposing? Is not the work you're doing, it's the risk and how we pay for it. The work is proposed to stay the same. Okay.
Broadly speaking, yes, that's a fair statement.
Thank you. That was my clarification.
Thanks, Seth. I've got Corky, Eric, and then I've got my own placard out.
That was also my question is, do we have any plans, even at 125? And I know it gets murky, but do we have any plans to drop any environmental justice or any equity projects?
Not currently, but again, we're dependent on that outside revenue to complete all the projects.
Understandable. So I want to make a couple of comments on this. I'm not on the Portland Metro Chamber, and I'm certainly not on staff, but been kind of around the edges of some of this conversation. And one thing that's been made very, very clear, certainly at the Metro Chamber, is they support what we're doing. And they support full accreditation. They support us meeting all of the federal guidelines. Have been very clear. Jim, there's been no backpedaling about that. They've said, yes, these projects are good. They need to get done. But I think we're all aware that the environment, the economic environment in Portland has changed in the past couple of years. Things are a little different than they were a short while back when we started this path toward the GEO bond. And by the way, when we talk about 195 million, we started at 175 million, 175 to 250. I believe I was the one that suggested we bump up from 175 to 195. So let's just be a little bit clear on that too. I don't like dropping these numbers either for all the reasons that have been put out here on the table. I'm uncomfortable with it, but at the same time, the economic environment has changed. And this conversation that we're having with the governor's office, keep in mind that we wouldn't be anywhere near here without the governor as speaker, without the speaker's support many years back. She's done a fantastic job for us and supported us all along the way. And now she's coming to us saying, we're in a bind here. This is difficult on the governor, it's difficult on the chamber to move forward with 195 or even 150 million. So they're asking a favor of us. And I would tend to say, especially when the governor's coming to us and saying, I think I can come up with another 30 or $40 million in state funding. I'm kind of inclined to do her a favor now. And in the hope that we find a way to come up with some additional funding down the road, which might be another bond a few years down the road. I know you mentioned earlier that would be difficult, but let's keep that in mind. So I guess the main thing I just want to get across is, in the conversations I've heard, nobody has criticized what we're doing here, and everybody has been fully supportive of getting full accreditation. But folks are in a bind, and they're trying to help us out, and I think that's the give and take we need to get out on the table right now.
Thanks, Corky, Eric, and then myself, Bob, and Nance.
So I need your political advice on this. We're asking for incrementally another $40 million in grants. And that makes the budget really work. Because what they would do is, in the 150 proposal, we get $10 million in loan against the 150 GEO bond total. That leaves us 140. We get $40 million in grants. That's 180. We get $5 million worth of admin costs. That's 185. And we get $5 million worth of interest and payments against the 40 million. So that's 190. Is that basically correct?
You're in the zone, yeah, there's.
Okay. Because the $10 million is just tranche one still comes out of our total geo bond authority of 150.
Correct.
Right? So that leaves 140 that we would get in other sources.
Well, we still will borrow 150 in total.
Right, 10 of which
10
is
of which is a low interest, no interest borrowing.
right. And so
So there's some interest cost savings there.
right. And so $40 million over 10 years, it's $5 million annually.
There's the way we balanced the 150 plus the 40 was we reduced our administrative allowance by $5 million. Part of that is because you don't have bond issuance costs on the $40 million that you're getting from the state. Part of that is you don't have ongoing administration related to the money that you get from the state. Part of that is just a reduction in flexibility for us because there are many ways that you use that administrative allocation of your bond. Part of it is to pay for things like a bond analyst over the years to be able to provide information to the bond accountability committee. But one of the other things that I have always been able to use my administrative allocation for is if I've got a cost overrun on one of my projects, I go to my board and say, can I take $500,000 out of my administration allocation and transfer that to this project so I can finish the project? So you're losing that flexibility. We're reducing we still have an administration allocation within that $190 million, but we're losing 5 million of it. Part of it is true savings because part of it is we're not going to have bond issuance costs. Part of it is
And interest expense on that.
we're not going to have interest expense.
Right.
But part of
So-
it is a loss of flexibility.
So let's talk about what the expected value is of the $40 million. And I get back to Eric Mueller's point, this is pretty risky. I don't have a good sense of how risky that is. And I need the combined political wisdom to say 40 million at 100% is a good number. It's unlikely to go up, but what's the risk that in the third biennium, it doesn't go in there? And you're the political part of this board, tell us what that number is.
Risk is higher than if you pass a bond at 195. And honestly, I don't know how to quantify that in a particular way, right?
You're gonna have to help me out because, the option is if they come back in at 35 million, maybe kind of, sort of, we could make that work through a combination of increased assessments and other things. But if it's 15, we're stuffed.
Gets harder every time. You're right. Yeah.
15, we can't do it.
And I think then the board's in a position of having to go out and ask voters for more revenue or go to the cities, go to the county, others. Yeah, you're identifying the risk. Putting a quantification to it is very challenging for us. So the other risk is you have members of this board or others in the community oppose our measure at a lower number, or you have governor and the chamber oppose it at a higher number, which creates additional risk too, right? And that's what you're balancing against.
Right, and so give us an example of when a promise has been made and then significantly broken by the legislature and the governor. Because when people ask about it, they say, oh, the governor approved it. No, we're good for it.
I think the only thing I can reflect on is our real experience, which is a really great track record of being successful working with the state and the legislature through the levy grant fund and our groundwork that we've done for the capital ask already, which has been received pretty warmly, at least by the Portland delegation. But this is above my pay grade, Eric. This is what a board does.
All right, I'll call on myself. I think about this very differently than most of you do. And I'll just go out and explain how I think about it. And I want to start with the core tenets, and that's kind of repeating a little bit of what Seth said earlier. It's that I completely believe that the projects included in the 195 are the important projects and we need to do them. I'm not in favor of reducing any environmental projects, but at 195, I also know that I think the latest we got was that the contingency included in that is roughly 40%. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we know today what those projects are going to cost to fully implement through the process. It could be 20%, it could be 100%. We don't know. And that's why I think about this in terms of a phased bonding approach. And I know we poo-poo that really quickly. I think, well, we're never going to do another bond. I don't believe that should be true personally. And this is informed a little bit by my conservatism coming from Gresham, where we try to pass things and we never get anything passed. So when I think about $100 million floating out there from the federal government, I say we need to grab that and we need to do it with conservative certainty now. So let's go out with a smaller, so I'm with Brent on the smaller package now, not reducing the commitment. In fact, trying to solidify harder as a board the commitment to the environmental projects that we have, and maybe there's board action we can take to ensure that that happens. And as we transition to a newer board, we ensure that that doesn't change, but also committing maybe the future board to this phased approach where we go out with a smaller bond to do the asset replacement projects that are included in that 195. All of the things, all of us that are responsible for public assets, we have to do these things for all of our infrastructure systems. We're in the same boat you are. You're no different. You can't go to the state, you can't go to anybody, PBA, state, the governor's office, and explain how you're special. You're not. You're in the same boat Gresham is. But I think to be, from the conservative side, we grab that with a smaller amount now. We get the support of the governor's office somehow, and I don't know the politics well enough at the state level to know how you better secure any commitment from the governor's office or the legislature on that $30 to $40 million commitment. I don't know how you do that. I'm not the expert there. But if this gives us any leverage, to Nancy's point, if there is any silver lining in this approach, and it does in some way get us state money, that's a huge win, because every time I went to the public, every time I heard the same thing. You guys are arguing that this is needed because it is a regional asset. The Portland Airport absolutely has to be protected, all these businesses. So therefore, the state should be paying more. It shouldn't just be us that live in this small little region right around this special place. So you kill two birds with one stone. You get to the comment I heard most frequently from the public, and I didn't have a response for it, except for, yeah, you're right. And you also more guarantee the success of our measure to get that $100 million in federal funding. And somehow we need to solidify the commitment to the environmental projects and all the asset projects that Bill has factored in there too. I'll get off my soapbox. Bob's up.
So I think the Portland Business Alliance ought to be sending every person in this room a thank you letter, candy and flowers. I think the fact is we've done a lot of hard work for them and for their constituents, and their constituents are the primary beneficiaries of this. This is the largest business district in Oregon. And I think we've done an awful lot of damn hard work, brought together a lot of diverse perspectives, very conservative perspectives, very liberal perspective, community, government, business. I think they ought to be saying thank you. They're saying another word. It ends with you, but it doesn't begin with thank you. And I think they're not asking us a favor. They're threatening to run a counter campaign. Let's be honest. No one in this room threatened to run a counter campaign over the last year, but the Portland Business Alliance came in, and that's where we started this conversation. And a lot of people are kowtowing to that. I think we need to think about the flip side of that now. I think we need to think about the fact that we have stakeholders that have been at this table for over a decade who have been committed, operated in good faith, worked through disappointment, broken assurances, delays, to get to a point where we all got to agreement a couple of weeks ago on 195. I think what they're doing is an abomination. And my perspective is that if they want to do this power play at the last minute, Go for it. They're playing a game of chicken, but the problem is they're playing with their own cars. They own both the cars. Tails you lose. Heads you lose. Because if you want to go and blow this thing up, go ahead. You're going to be back in a year where we were in 2011. No money, no plan, no friends. The only difference is you're on the wrong side of the time equation, right? Because we were decertified 6 years ago. You're out of time. I'm a no vote on anything other than 195. And I will oppose this measure. I will work with Steve and I will work with Jim to figure out whether that makes sense for me to stay on the board. But I have acted in good faith for 13 years. And I don't think the community ought to be expected to do what Steve just described of ponying up for this regional thing that's so important. If the business community that is the primary beneficiary is not ready to step up and meet the mandates of the district, the environmental justice, the environment, the climate resiliency, the answer they're giving is give us what we need to do the bare minimum. I don't think that's acceptable at this point in time. Not after all these years, not after passing legislation, not after going out to the public and telling them over and over that we're bigger and better than what we're being asked to be now. And so my answer to the PBA is fine. You want to pull this stunt? Go for it. We're going to oppose. And for those people who are frightened of the PBA opposing, I think Mary Helen really described it well. You ought to be a lot more frightened of the community groups opposing, because you're going to need that credibility at the end of the day to get the votes. And you're not going to have it. And for those people that say to me, how could you do this? How could you put this region at risk? My answer to them is, first of all, we've known about this for 13 years. We've been at risk every day of that time. But we wanted to do something bigger, so we put it off. We could have done this 13 years ago if we're doing it this way. We wasted just a lot of time and resources. We got a whole district for no reason. And so we're not the ones that would be shutting this thing down. It's the PBA. It's on them. And if they want to do that, that's fine. If this board wants to do that, that's its prerogative. But we will be a strong no vote on this issue, and we will oppose.
I think we were at Brent's next. And I'm unclear as to whether we were at Nancy or Eric or Emerald. You guys will have to rock, paper, scissors. Brent.
Two questions. One, do we think that the results of the polling have changed based on the announcement of the task force with new taxes? And considering the 195?
Interesting question. I would say that the polling probably hasn't changed based on that, but I could imagine, just given general conditions, that it certainly hasn't improved. Noah, do you want to?
Sure. I know there's.
Could whoever asked the question repeat it?
Mary Helen, the question was, do we think that the results of the polling, which is, I think, one of the bases for why we were okay with 195 with the announcement from the task force, do we think that the polling results have changed due to that announcement?
So this is Noah Siegel. I was on the consulting team for the polling. So just a brief reminder around what our findings were. They're we polled relatively recently, so less than 6 months ago. I don't think anything has dramatically shifted in the electorate over those 6 months. Let's be 6 months, really. I just think the questions asked in the two polls were very different. So we put the question of, at this cost, for this issue, would you support a property tax bond? And if you recall, the answer was well over 60% in support, upwards of 200,000. But that support was very, sorry, that's fine, keep saying that. Million.
We know what you mean.
It's important to get it right on the record. 200 million. So we had, that was the conversation we had around getting between 175 and 195. But if you recall, also that support was very shallow. So it was generally positively disposed towards the measure, but we knew that really any organized opposition could take significant percentage points off that lead. So that was our number one priority, was to get as broad a consensus as we possibly could. The question asked, in my understanding from the Portland Metro Chamber polling, was, are taxes too high? Is that a problem for you? And the answer was, I think 60-something, 67% yes. I think those two things can be simultaneously correct. We saw that in our polling as well, that people were disgruntled with local government, with the state of finances. And at the same time, people felt like this was reasonable. It was a fairly low cost, high return, especially considering the federal money. So they were able to hold those things both true at the same time. We saw that again in the focus groups. So just to summarize, I think both polling results are correct. I believe they both remain accurate. I believe the highest vulnerability comes from organized opposition to this, but that people generally do support it still.
But since the announcement was made after that, don't you think that voters would then?
I guess my experience in 35 years of doing this work is that if you went out on the street and asked 1,000 voters whether they've heard of the moratorium, the answer is going to be no.
There's an opportunity too for the governor, the PBA, the mayor, the Port of Portland, all of us to stand up there together and say, hey, we have a moratorium, but we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our faces. And there are some things that are different. And there's $100 million on the table, and there's a 13-year process. And there's a whole lot of people that have come together, and we're decertified already, and we're at risk of catastrophic flood. And so this one is different. And although we still adhere to the basic principle, and we're going to oppose most bond measures, we're going to stand here together at 195 and tell you that you ought to move this one forward.
And Brent, politically, I think the shift is that you've got a governor and a downtown association that's more poised to do active opposition as a result of the moratorium, but the voters don't know about that.
Jim, who are you more concerned about, the environmental community or the PBA?
It's for the board to decide. I'd rather have you both on board, Bob. You know that.
Let's go.
I love you all the same.
We were preparing a campaign to start today, just so folks know. We already wrote an op-ed. We were about to launch and move the community with us. So we went from hard yes to hard no on this. So folks are aware.
Just in regards to the neutral position on the 150, granted, they wanted, I think what you guys were saying was they wanted to see the language of the bond. Is there any clarification in terms of what would position that to a hard no if we proposed a 150? Because I guess the concern that I have is what was warned in Federalist Paper number 10, what I'm seeing here. And so that's, I think, just a warning in terms of what happens when all these interests get shared at the same time.
I feel confident that we would stay with a neutral position and an announced neutral position that would say something to the effect of this is different and warrants consideration by voters. I also think there's probably an opportunity after this discussion to go back to the folks and say, hey, we got some hard opposition that's going to create trouble for you and we need you to reconsider. I don't know that the number would change, but I think there's an argument that we should be thinking about that might get them to a stronger than neutral position at 150. And we can go back at 195 too, if that's the direction of the board. You guys have to balance these political risks at this point. Staff can't do that for you.
Let's go with Nancy.
You know, well, there's many great things about being in person, and one of them is you don't have to find the unmute button. So just in terms of risk and who pays for what, I mean, the same people are paying for it, right? If it comes out of operating or if it comes out of capital, the same people are paying for it, and that is the Multnomah County within the UGB. People in the floodplain also pay assessments, so that's part of our operating. But the sooner we can move forward out of the 7 board conglomeration that we have right now, the better. But our operating forecast, like anything going out of capital into operating, is going the wrong direction. Like we do not have funding there in our medium term needs, like our 10-year needs. I really don't see it. So I'm very concerned about taking anything out of capital and putting it into operating. And
I want to clarify for you that in the forecast, there is operating capital set aside and there's capital contingency set aside.
I understand.
It's a small number, but there's not nothing.
Okay, yeah, and I didn't mean to imply that.
Okay.
I guess I'm reiterating like that 16.7 that we're starting with, and then it's going to go up a tiny amount every year is already constrained. And so looking to that to backfill anything we don't go out with for the bond, I think is a real problem. And I think we need to be very cognizant of active opposition because yeah, and just to put it into geographic terms, something that Bob alluded to is that there are residences, I think 8,000 residences behind the levees. Most of it is business. It's Portland's industrial sanctuary anyway. And then the rest of Multnomah County is a lot of residences, like, I don't know, 600,000 or something. I'm sure that number's wrong, but it's a lot more than 8,000. So it is going more towards the community. And so I just wanted to offer that perspective as well in our calculations.
Thanks, Nancy. Let's go Emerald, Eric, Seth.
Really good discussion, and trickiest problems in the world are the ones where everyone's absolutely right and it's just conflicting, right? And so I think that the decision that will be guiding the board is the one that's in the context of the moment that we're in. And I don't think that anyone needs to be told about the regional tax fatigue and the not great news stories that go on and how it lends to this overall climate, which is the thing that led to the Central City Task Force and the thing that has led to a moratorium on taxes that was announced by the governor. So our interest in this exercise, when it came up around, oh no, gosh, I know nothing can come through right now. No new taxes. That's it. The question became, well, why this? Why now? The answer to that was, well, if you don't do this right now, if you push it out for a couple of years, you're going to lose $100 million in federal funding, and you're going to risk the losing accreditation. Those are not outcomes that are acceptable by any stretch of the imagination. And so the urge has been, what is a path that we can go down, understanding that this measure falls in an achievable zone, but not in a slam dunk. So it is vulnerable to organized and funded opposition. Yes, Bob, on either side. You're totally right about that. And so the port is not in favor of compromise just for the hell of it, this compromise for the sake of compromise. We're in favor of compromise for the sake of $100 million of federal funding and accreditation of the levy system, which should not be taken for granted. And I think the stakes of assuming that it's hard to kill this, and the stakes are very high. And so the 195 sounds great. Yes, 150 probably more achievable, right? I mean, we're in the zone of needing to see a path forward where the governor can give this her blessing, and attempting to avoid organized and funded opposition. And Bob, your points are well taken too. So it's extremely tricky, but we want to support the leadership of the governor in the conversation.
Thanks, Emerald. Eric.
I guess two kind of quick clarifications for Jim. I mean, one, your recommendation today is that the board get all this update, but not rush to a decision today, that we have time to wait.
I would like to rephrase and say, I would really like clear direction from you. How you want me to spend my next 2 weeks between this meeting and the 7th?
Well, that was my next question, was whether there was more, lack of a better term, politicking plan between now and the next meeting, or whether all of that is already behind us.
That's up to what you guys decide today. You could pick 125 and be done and deal with the campaign against, or you can deal with 195 and deal with the campaign against, or you can direct me to go back and try and cut a different deal that brings you all along. Those are your choices. Or you can defer and not refer anything. and see if more time lets
I
this settle.
don't think, we're not gonna vote today.
Yeah.
So.
Those are the directions I need you guys to give me some.
Yeah, we are planning to vote at the early February, at February 7th, meeting. So, I guess it is worthwhile hearing from the board, although we don't have a lot of time. We've got 4 minutes.
But this conversation is worth going a little bit over.
It is. Now, up next, we had, Eric. You're up next.
I was done.
You were done, so Seth.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on the discussion, you know, this isn't a bare bones bond. When we look at what's required just for the Army Corps certification and the FEMA certification, it's not a $195 million bond. We put a lot of other things that were board priorities for environmental, as well as catching up from the deferred maintenance backlog that's been building over the last 20 or 30 years because it was the right thing to do. And we've been having to balance that, you know, going back to our respective boards of saying, hey, we were told the ask was going to be this, and now it's 3 or 4 times that. And how do we, I mean, for me, it's get something that's not perfect, but that's achievable, given that you have communities that have never paid for this service that are now going to be paying. Sounds like the state's kicking in money, that there's going to have to be some amount of compromise on all sides, because it's been, since I've been on here, it's been nothing but compromise and push back and forth on this. So Jim, I appreciate your efforts and staff's efforts, and my direction would be try to continue to thread the needle where we have enough people that get 80% of what they want and can live with it.
Thanks, Seth. I'm gonna call on Commissioner Stegman.
Thank you, Steve. I want to appreciate this really intense conversation and very in-depth. I agree with everything that Emerald Bogue has stated. I'm very concerned about the environmentalists opposing, but it doesn't look like we have a path forward where we won't have opposition, which is very disheartening. I think the best we can do is hope for neutrality and go for the 150. But as an elected, my job is to do the greatest good for the most people. And as Emerald said, getting accreditation and getting the $100 million that's on the table, I have a responsibility to ensure that we have access to that money. Now, with that being said, I'm not super confident or optimistic that the state is going to be able to show up with $30 to $40 million. But that is, you know, it's something about, you know, holding your nose and voting for things that you're not 100% in love with. But unfortunately, I think that is the best we can do at this moment in time.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think Corky had his.
I wanted to address, because Jim, if I were in your shoes, I'd ask the same thing. Give me some, some direction, yeah. And so to that end, I'm going to summarize what I understand, and somebody jump in and tell me when I'm completely wrong here. But what I hear is anything below 195, Bob is aware of a group that is going to oppose that. At 150, we don't have the governor's support, but we don't have her opposition either. She's neutral on it at 150. But we do get 30, 40.
We don't know, but I don't think that.
That's what I heard.
Spot with the chamber. I think that's where the chamber is, and I would hold tight on hearing the position of the governor.
Well, that's why I try to give some
I think
direction.
it's safe, but we don't have a confirmation.
Yeah.
And the chamber and the governor have been very, very clear that they are in sync with each other, is what I hear also. Again,
that's what I heard from staff from both entities.
And then at 125, I believe I hear that we have the governor's support, active support, plus the 30 or 40 million dollars, same as 150. Does that summarize it fairly well?
I think Yeah, I think that's fair.
Just, and I mean, this is as clear as a
I
bank of
think that-
fog, you know, I mean,
I
yeah.
mean, I think what the governor's interest is in having peace.
So-
And not and that the criteria for exemption, for a rationale for letting this one through is solid. And
So-
that a piece of that rationale is the number coming down. I don't think that she's getting it, tattooed with a number.
So to your question, one thing I would suggest, just throwing out there on the table, is going to the governor and the Metro Chamber and saying, can we get your support at 150? Can we get 150 plus the 30 or $40 million and your active support? Because if we're gonna have opposition from one community at 195, we're gonna need that active support. Or alternatively, if they can only give us support at 125, can we get the governor to promise that she will actually lobby for $40 to $50 million from the state? You know, so that would be, if I were in your shoes, that's the sort of thing I would throw that out there. And again, this is constantly moving target. It's vague. I understand all that, but you were asking for some clarification. Those would be my suggestions.
Tanny had your hand up earlier.
This has been a great discussion, but a couple things, I'm from Troutdale, okay, and we can't pass a bond for City Hall, let alone anything else. Okay, so it's a little different, I guess, kind of perspective. And I look at it, I think you don't want to have any opposition at all, no matter who it's coming from. And I think at the end of the day, not getting the 100 million is a lose-lose all the way around for everybody. I don't care if you own a business or you're an environmentalist or you're a staff member. I don't care who you are, you lose. Everybody loses. So we got to find a way to get that money. And I think we've got to come to some type of an agreement where we don't have the opposition. And putting it that it's this or nothing, I just don't see how that's going to work. We've got to get to a point where everybody can live with it. And I'd also say no vote today.
Bob was up next and then Mary Helen.
Yeah, I think we worked very hard for the last year to get to a point where everybody could live with it. I think it's what we've been doing for a long time. I think, as Ashton said, an outside force has come in now and threatened us. And yes, it's the governor and the PBA, but I also think there's an opportunity for this board to push back or this board to roll over. You will have opposition at that price point. This is the same opposition, by the way, that defeated the governor down in Salem last year on the last day of the session on her housing bill. This is the same coalition that defeated the PBA at City Hall last week on one of their other anti-environmental agenda items. So there's a long history here. I hope we do push back hard. I hope we make the good fight. Maybe we don't win that. But I think, I don't agree with you on the idea that, I think it is a lose-lose. I mean, I am heartbroken that we're in this situation at this point. There's a reason I stuck to the table for 13 years. But I don't think somebody coming in this way and basically telling us that we're going to drop it by 50%, 40% is an acceptable thing. I think it's a recipe for a complete and total train wreck and losing faith with the community. And I do think that a coalition of grassroots organization on this versus government agencies who are not held in high esteem and the largest businesses in the state of Oregon is going to go down. And I believe that the right answer to the PBA and their friends and their enablers is if you don't want to do the right thing, if you don't want to do the thing that the community's worked on for a couple of years, then please be our guest and pay for it yourself. You are the most wealthy entities in the state, some of the most wealthy entities in the planet in some cases. If you don't want to do this, come up with your own $100 million match and do it yourselves. I think that's going to play really well. And I'm really sad to say that because this is not the position I wanted to be in. But this is not an acceptable end game for a ballot measure like this. And you need the community behind you. Okay, go pick up my kids.
Sorry. I have follow-up for you, but if you have to pick it with kids, go. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob.
I guess I'll just make a quick comment and then without question, but I guess I'm having a hard time understanding if the support somehow from the state could be further solidified in any way. I don't know how that gets done. I don't understand the opposition because that brings it back to the 190.
It does. It can't, it's not, the governor can't make a commitment of the legislature. So it's, you would be hinging it on, but that is, there's a very strong track record of this going pretty well with political will aligned and the mutual work of the particular public agency, government affairs staff
So there's
advancing these things.
and there's a healthy commitment to environmental projects included. So Bob's saying that he would lobby against a package that includes millions and millions of dollars for environmental projects that wouldn't exist otherwise.
The $150 million package includes all of what was in your $195 million package for the.
So that's what I'm having a hard time getting my head wrapped around it. And I would welcome at the next meeting, you know, for.
I would say that the substantive investments are still there.
And I guess what Bob has shared with me is that his opposition is not based on that. I think he was very grateful that staff tried to maintain those investments, but his opposition is not based on that. So I want to make clear with you, if those of you want to talk to Bob and argue with him,
yeah,
he's already pushed back on me, because that was my first command to staff is bring me 125 with Bob's stuff in, bring me 150 with Bob's stuff in.
Yeah.
We're not compromising on that. And it didn't work.
Well, it feels it feels personal. And I'm sorry to say that, but this isn't about personalities. This is about moving the work forward for the region.
And there are members of the chamber that it feels personal about too.
Both sides,
So
both
just
sides.
share that.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on.
No judgment in that statement.
Mary Helen.
It's getting fun now, right?
I'm sorry Bob had to leave because my question, and maybe we can defer the vote and ask him, because I haven't heard anybody say, or Bob even say, and someone just said about we're getting millions and millions of dollars for projects that weren't going to be funded and won't be funded if his group opposes this. Is there a way that it can involve, let's just say we take the 125 million, 150 million, and secure whatever funding we can get and prioritize what we use that funding for. And environmental issues, yes. I'm not a politician. I just hear what neighbors say, and there's people that love politicians and city council and county commissioners and metro commissioners, but they also have a disregard, as Noah said, about trusting government. And so that climate is out there, and our political representatives have to represent people and their needs, and to be able to put them in a position to have to choose between housing and feeding children and having safe places for them to be. They have to decide, you only get this much money. You just don't get a checkbook to write the checks. I want to acknowledge the fact that Ashton Simpson was a U.S. Air Force veteran, and he knows that there are many houseless veterans in Portland. And if they could get $125 million to house those veterans, that issue would have to be something that he would have to decide. To put the blame on the PBA for whatever reason that they put out a claim, can we go back and say to them, okay, this is the feedback we got, enlist Bob to help write grants to make up that money, because there's a lot of grant money out there now for climate change efforts, which would fall into that. And as opposed to totally opposing it, all or nothing seems a little bit irreverent, but that's what you have to do when you're a advocate for an organization that deals with the environment. But at $125 million, environmental programs are going to get a whole lot more money than they would get if we get nothing. And that could happen if we go for 195 million, the bond doesn't pass, we're back to square one. And God help all the rest of you, another 13 years of trying to figure out how and where to get the money. I don't think I'll live that long. I've had a disaster of a year health-wise, so I might be playing on my third chance here. So I think that we need to recognize that it's not necessarily take the money and run, but be able to see if maybe there's $130 million, somewhere between 125 and 150. And I support everything that Corky said about Governor Kotek, then Representative Kotek, used to meet regularly in the Canton Firehouse where her office was and ask questions about Penn 2 and how it was going and how the project, and she toured the levees and rode in the MCDD boat and went on a tour of everything. So she's been highly supportive, but she also has a constituency that she has to balance multiple needs, and how that would look if they had to take money out of the budget and give it to a levee project for environmental threats. I don't know. And I don't know if we could withstand the environmental resistance, but I think
What I'm hearing you say is we should keep negotiating. Is that correct?
yeah, if we can go back and say, this is what we heard from the board, how about this? You know,
Thank you.
how about you help us with the grants, partner with us on the grants? That would
Thank
be.
you, Mary Helen. I think others need to speak.
We are getting short on time.
Sorry.
Guys. We're gonna try to wrap up by 3:15. I saw Taylor and then Seth, and then we're gonna look to wrap up. Oh, I'm sorry, Eric, Taylor's, and then Seth.
I'll keep it, oh, sure.
So I support the $195 million in projects. I support getting the state to recognize their requirement to pay $40 million of it. That's a fair share for this that has statewide benefit. And at 150, I would negotiate to get active support from the PBA.
And they've offered that. Just
Right, so if we can get the PBA active at 150, not 125, then the argument is we've got the 195 in terms of projects. That's our focus, and it will give us resources so that if there's a grassroots effort, we can combat it.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
I'll try to keep it really short. I think I wanted to bring up two things. First of all, one of the things I heard Bob say that we haven't really noted in this room, but I want to lift up, is that he referenced the legislative process as well. And in addition to our bond, we also need to pass a bill this session. So as we have this conversation about the bond, I recognize that that's separate from the legislative concept, however, they're related. And I think we just need to think about how to work through those two together. The other thing that I wanted to remind everybody about is that we are in an election year. And while I can appreciate what Corky said about this being, the governor and PBA being aligned, I want to remind everyone that the governor is elected and PBA is not. And so their roles in this process are really different. And yet they do, so PBA's reach is not just the governor, right? They also have an impact on everyone else in that legislative process. So we're going to have to be careful as we thread this needle. And I think your idea about coming back, talking about this meeting and seeing if we can get weak support from PBA for 150, not active. I think we can probably not expect that from them, but I think that's like maybe our best path forward, but we are going to have to figure out in the legislative session how to contend with Bob's feelings about how the conversation went today.
Thank you, Taylor. Seth?
Yeah, I would just, along the same lines, if staff could reach out to Bob and find out what, if anything else, can be done. He's brought up a number of times that he's worried that as you get into the process, the cuts are going to come all out of environmental, and he's not going to, the projects, when push comes to shove, that's what's going to get cut. I think that there might be some creative solutions for that. The cities were insistent that there was an IGA for the collection of the utility money from the on the utility bills until we put our concerns in the legislation to have a cap of CPI enshrined in legislation. So I don't know if there's opportunities or things he might consider, like having some minimums put into the legislation or some other considerations that we could do that could memorialize his concerns and assuage whatever those are. And so I think that it would be worth at least reaching out, because if we get $195 million and all the projects that were included in there get done and we can assuage some of his concerns, I would hope that he would see that we're trying to meet all of the things that he's brought up and expressed concern about.
Thanks, Seth.
Mr. Chair, may I try and summarize what I think my direction
Please.
is and see how it lands with
Good
you
luck.
all? Call Bob, see if there's a deal at less than 195. Talk to the governor's office and the state about really memorializing the state commitment to 40 million, hopefully getting that in writing and trying to tighten it down to the degree we can, knowing that there's legislative action required. And let the chamber know that candidly, what I heard from this board is we need their active support and endorsement at a minimum of 150, and more would be better. And we also need a written document that commits them to supporting our efforts to get the state funding. Is that about right?
Good. I would call those aspirations, goals, but not demands.
Right, well,
Because you can't-
this is what I'm allowed to
Yeah.
tell you, Chamber and Governor, based on direction from my board. And at this point, I don't know what the board's decision will be if we don't get these things. And I don't know what it'll be even if we do. But
And
the
Jim,
key-
where are we at as far as getting the governor's endorsement?
What I can tell you is in talking with the governor's staff, the governor was clear that she supported a lower number if possible. I also was very clear and restated it to make sure I had it right, that if we can get the chamber to agree to a number, the governor's unlikely to oppose it.
Okay, well, I mean, that's good that she's unlikely to oppose it, but will she endorse it?
I'm not a gambling man, Commissioner, but I believe if we can get the chamber and the board together around a number that the governor will support it. But I don't speak for the governor and I don't have permission to say that, but that's my read of the tea leaves and the conversations that we've had.
I guess my perspective would be a little bit more direct and say 150, and we want the PBA and the governor's endorsement.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Can I know we're late, but real quick, compliments to staff, because a week or so ago, it was from both the governor's office and Portland Metro Chamber, any ask, for taxes is off the table. We can't, because we've already promised no new taxes. So look where we are now. This is a huge jump up. So thank you, guys. Good job.
We are not in a bad place.
Well, one last sort of silver lining, we all have a touch of gray as we tap at each other. In talking to members of the task force in the chamber and telling our story, I think we have greater awareness and likely easier time getting help with the private effort that we'll launch after.
It is.
I do think that Noah is correct and Bob is correct, that if Bob is really activated and running an opposition campaign, it'll be hard for us. And if you look across the Portland landscape at the record of the chamber in winning or defeating elections, it's not great. They have new staff and they have a new director and they're more active. And but yeah, there's risk all around, y'all, and I think we're getting close. And I am hopeful that with a stronger commitment, we can help Bob see that maybe there's a path forward. But I can't commit to that either. So I feel like I know what I need to do. I'm really grateful for this conversation and the feedback. I think you guys have landed in a responsible place. And I guess my commitment to you is we'll schedule a follow-up on February 7th. And I have to think through how I can best communicate with all of you as we work through these next steps. So I'm going to think about that with my colleagues in the governor's office and the chamber. And guess what I'm committing to is trying to turn up the volume and frequency of communication back out to you so you're aware of what's going on and can maybe be a little bit more active in giving me direction as we work through these things. So I appreciate those of you who've attended some of these things outside of your normal hours, and those of you who have been able to give me feedback as I've been working through this. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Okay, so be it. We are adjourned. Thank you all.
The best thing you could do for your travel.